Hello and welcome to this edition of Labs and Latte, a show where we dig into the NRA Labs curriculum while sipping on our favorite bean-based beverages. And today I'm finishing off a nice tall glass, short glass I suppose, but it was tall when I started, a glass of Stumptown Nitro. It's one of my favorite cold brews. I'm not a huge cold brew fan. I used to be a lot more of a fan, but I've started to make more lattes and macchiatos and straight espresso shots lately as I acquired a new espresso machine a few months ago. However, I digress. This is the first edition of Labs and Latte, and this is a video series I'm kicking off to dig into very specific topics related to automation and other things within the NRA Labs curriculum because I think that they warrant further exploration. And on this first edition, I'm very excited because I'm going to be talking about Git. Now, a quick aside on Git. If you're not familiar, it is a version control system. Version control systems are it's a tool that software developers have used for a long time. Basically, if you're working on software, one of the things that you want to be able to do is know when certain changes were made, by who, and ideally provide a way for multiple, or rather a team of people really, to do that in a distributed fashion. And some version control tools do it in different ways. Git is what's referred to as a distributed version control system. What that means is everybody sort of manages their own version of the repo. Repo meaning an instance of a code base or just really a set of text files. And then there are tools for allowing people to make changes and bring changes into different repos on a platform like GitHub, for instance. So we're not going to get into all of that. What we're going to start with today is just the very fundamentals. Let's create our first Git repository. So I'm going to go through this lesson, and we'll walk through step by step. So as it shows in the lesson, some of what I've said, this is a tool that software developers have been using for a long time to improve the way that they manage changes to their code. So it's not just about managing changes. It allows you to collaborate with folks. It allows you to undo changes, for instance. So if you'd like to roll back a change that maybe didn't go the way you thought it would, it's very useful. Now, as is mentioned in the lesson, there's absolutely nothing about Git or version control in general that requires you to be a software developer. And I think this is a really important point because I think this is one of the reasons why Git has become so ubiquitous. And you've probably heard of things like infrastructure as code or GitOps, things like that. Why is it that this software developer tool is making its way into my world as an infrastructure professional? And I think this is part of the reason. As more and more of our tools, whether they be tools that allow you to manage cloud infrastructure or a basic script that goes against your storage arrays, programmatic API, whatever it is, these are all text files. That's all they are. And so even though in the most popular case, a tool like Git is used as a version control tool for software developers to manage massive, Java code bases, there's absolutely nothing about Git that means that you have to use it that way. If you just want to manage, say, a bunch of YAML files or Jinja snippets or even just straight up network configurations just as text files, that's totally fine. Git is not opinionated on that at all. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's becoming so popular in the infrastructure space, because it's not very opinionated in that way. So this is going to be a multi-phase lesson. I'm not going to go over everything in this video. There will be following videos for the next few chapters in this lesson. In this chapter, what I want to go over is, what is a Git repo? You keep hearing this term Git repo or repository. What is it? Let's create one. Let's have our first experience with one, and let's walk through some of the options that gives us. Now, when you're in this lesson, if you want to follow along, by the way, go to nrelabs.io and go to the lesson catalog. It's just titled Introduction to Git, and you'll get the exact same screen that I'm getting. Please follow along if you'd like. So the very first thing that we want to do, we have a Linux shell here. It's just a Linux container that allows us to run commands. So the first thing we want to do is we want to make a new directory. And if you are familiar with Linux, that command is mkdir space my first repo. And then we can also, let's just run that. And if you'd like, obviously you don't have to type anything. If you'd like to, I'm just going to type what's in these snippets. If you'd like to just click run this snippet, you can absolutely do that. So we go into that directory. This is just a plain old directory. There's nothing in it. Nothing in this directory. When you're thinking about a Git repository, think of it as a container for things that Git needs to know about. And so in order to start that process, you need to initialize a new repository. So you could think of a repository as nothing more than a directory that you've told Git to start tracking. And the way that we do that is we say git init. So this just initializes a new Git repository, and it says it's empty. Git doesn't know about anything in this directory. There's nothing in the directory to know about anyway. What it did was it created a directory called .git within that. And you can even look at some of those files if you'd like. I'm not going to go into detail on these in this lesson. If you'd like to go deeper with Git, there's a lot of resources out there that dive into these details specifically. I'm just going to sort of help you get your first repo off the ground for now. But that's basically what we've did. So other than that, there's nothing in this directory. All we've done is we've initialized the Git repository, which for our intents and purposes is a directory with a .git directory inside of it. And so that's it. That's our first Git repository. Now, obviously, we want to be able to do stuff with it. So the first thing is we need to know how to configure Git. So Git needs to know a few things. Before we get started, there are a few things that Git needs to know about us and about the repository we're creating. Now, normally, the way that you configure Git is through a file in your user directory. And you can see we can cat that file here, but it doesn't exist. And the reason is we haven't told Git about us or about anything about our desired configuration. So if you scroll down, you'll see that there's a new command called git config. Now this command basically just says, look, I want to create or set a sort of a variable, if you will. It's a way of telling Git about a specific aspect of its configuration. Now in this example, you can see the two things that we're going to be configuring is our email address and our name. Now I want to take a quick aside on this because it's important in this day and age, especially if you're going to be working with GitHub, to provide this information. But the very first thing it needs is your email address and your username. Now these don't actually have to, if you're talking about Git, these don't actually have to be correct. You can put anything in here you want. When it comes time to something like GitHub, which we'll cover in a future version of this lesson, GitHub actually uses this email address to track, to make sure that when you push commits, which we'll get into later, into GitHub, that it gives you credit for those things. And so I would encourage you to use a correct email address. You don't have to, but if you do use a correct email address and you link it to your GitHub profile, you'll get credit for the commit. So when you do this configuration, I would recommend doing it with a correct email address. But if you have no intention of working in GitHub and you just want to work locally, it really doesn't matter what's in here. So you set your user.email and then your user.name. Those are sort of like the keys for the variables that you're about to set. So if you type git config, now the flag global, I want to take a quick aside here. As is mentioned here in the lesson, there are a few different scopes for these configurations to take place. You've got your local scope, so meaning the configuration option that you're setting is only applicable to this Git repo. So if you created another Git repo in a different directory, the configuration options that you're applying here would not exist. Those options would only be specific to that repo. Going up a level, if you go to the global scope, which is provided here in the flag --global, what that does is it creates a configuration option that is applicable to any repo created by the current user. And if you specify that, it's going to get created in that git config file that I mentioned up here, where it says cat, and then in your user directory, .git config. Make sense? So what that means is if you create configuration options at that scope, then any Git repo that's created or managed by the current user will have those configuration options. And then finally, the very highest scope is the system scope. This is a config placed within on Linux, it's /etc. I don't know what it is on Windows, but I imagine it's something similar. Basically, this is an option for all repositories on the system, regardless of the user. I don't see that option used very much. Usually, Git is something that you deal with on a per user or a per repo basis. So the global and local scope are much more important. Now, as I'll explore in a little bit, these scopes do override each other. So local overrides global, and global overrides system. So if you have local options, those override similar options in other scopes. So git config global, we'll do this at a global perspective. This is pretty common. Again, the global scope is done for all repositories of the current user, so it kind of makes sense that those two options for username and for your name and for your email address are done at the global scope. So we'll do that here. Oops, there we go. User.name. Oops, I scrolled down way too far. Let's keep track of where we're going. User.name, Jane Doe. Cool. And then we can do up and backspace to do user.email, and we'll say jane@enerylabs.io. Cool. So now, if you look at that file which we saw earlier, so that .git config in our user directory, so you do cat we'll do cd, let's just stay in the directory, and we'll just use the absolute path, cat git config, just to keep things simple. You can see that there's contents in this file. Now, we didn't actually edit this file ourselves. You can see further up that when we, apologies, my phone just went off. You can see further up when we actually tried to look at the contents of this file, it didn't exist. So simply by adding these two commands, git config, with these two options, you can see that the file is automatically created for us and formatted the way that Git likes it. So we don't have to deal with the file ourselves. We just work through Git. So that's great. Now, if we want to look at the config, obviously we can look at the file, but if in case the file is huge, some git configs can be large. You can also look at git config with the flag list. And then, of course, if you want, you can specify the global scope, and it'll tell you those options in a succinct format there. Now, as I mentioned, these different scopes can override each other. So if you have, let's say, somebody on a system where they're where they're logged in as a certain user, maybe some sort of an admin user of some kind, like a service account, or they're logged in on behalf of somebody else, but they want to make a commit as them. So basically, there's a different user for this repo than there is for the system or the logged in user. You can actually override that. So when we specify git config and do not pass a scope flag, it defaults to local. So we can actually say user.email, and we'll say a totally different user email here at nrelabs.io. And we'll do user.name Jimmy Doe. Now, again, local overrides global. So if we do git config, we'll do list, and we'll leave global out. You can see that the new username here is Jim at nrelabs.io and Jimmy Doe. Now, if we add the show origin flag on top of that, you can see where these different options actually originated from. So the local config takes precedence, so that's why it's here on the bottom. You can see all of the options that are here in the local config. The global config is up here as well, but again, because local overrides global, these options aren't actually in use for us while we're in this repository. So very important to keep in mind. So yeah, and that is sort of it. So to recap, the three commands that we learned, we have git init, which initializes a new Git repository. So you have a directory. Let's say you have some files in that directory, which we'll cover in the next video. You create git init, and what that'll do is it'll tell Git, hey, I want to initialize a new repo here. And that's the very first thing you have to do before you're allowed to do anything else. And if you don't have a Git repo, you don't have anything. So that's the first thing. The git config command allows you to both read and write to the configuration at any one of those three scopes. And again, to remind you, those are global, or rather at the bottom, local is the most important, most precedent. And then you have the global scope, and then you have the system scope. And then finally, looks like we don't have git show in this lesson, so this is a little mistake in the lesson guide. So that'll get fixed. Git show, I'll spoil it a little bit, why not? It's a way of looking at a specific thing in Git. So like if you make a commit, or if you wanted to look at, say, some other reference in Git, you can do git show to take a peek at it. But more on that in the next lesson. For now, though, this is it for Labs and Latte. Finish that coffee and let us know what you think about NRE Labs. NRE Labs, of course, can be found at nrelabs.io. If you want to let us know how we're doing, let us know on Twitter, and that's at NRE Labs. And we look forward to seeing you on the next version of Labs and Latte. Thanks for watching.